What a name this guy has. Rodolfo Argentino Redolfi. Rodolfo Redolfi. Say that 3 times fast. Rodolfo Redolfi, Rodolfo Redolfi, Rodolfo Redolfi. That's about as fast as I can try. Redolfi was born May 25th, 1928. He passed away December 2nd, 2013 at the age of 85. He was a grandmaster of correspondence chess. Now, it's interesting. We saw a game against Osvaldo Bazan last week. Bazan was a 10-time Cordoba province champion. Well, Redolfi was also a 10-time Cordoba province chess champion. Redolfi won that title in 1952, 53, 54, 56, 57, 59, 60, 72, 79, and 1988. So that's a 36-year span at the top of Cordoba province chess. We get e4 here, and we all know Bobby plays the Sicilian. c5, knight f3, d6. Now bishop b5 check. We actually saw Bobby play this last time against Olafsson. You'll remember the game against Friedrich Olafsson. This is called Canal's attack because it's named for Esteban Canal. He was born April 19th, 1896. He lived until February 14th, 1981. Canal was a leading Peruvian chess player. He had his best results in the 1920s and 1930s. So Canal's attack is bishop b5. Bishop d7 is the main line. Bishop takes the bishop. Queen takes the bishop. Now he castles. That's where he loves to be. Notice how these 3 pawns create a barrier. We call them our pawn shield. And they create a big barrier protecting the king. Knight c6 here. And now pawn d3 is not the book move. The book move calls for pawn c3, which supports pawn d4, by the way. So after knight f6, for example, we have d4. This is Haag's gambit. Haag as in not H-O-G, but as like in Haagen-Dazs, H-A-A-G. Haag's gambit. That's named for Erwin Haag. Erwin Haag lived from January 11th, 1933 to 23 October 2018, and he was an international master from Hungary. We get knight takes e4 here, pawn d5, knight e5, rook e1, knight takes f3 check, queen takes knight, knight back to f6, and c4. And the most common continuation here is e5, pawn takes pawn en passant, and pawn takes pawn. Let's go back. Rodolfo instead playing pawn d3. e6, g7 is going to be often played in these Sicilian openings. g6, bishop g7, sort of a Dragendorf setup. Well, he didn't actually play Najdorf's because it was Esteban Canal's attack. But yeah, you could play g6 here. Let's see what the bot gives it. A check mark. But e6 from Fischer. Queen's knight to d2. Now g6 is played. But g6 is playable in almost all of these Sicilian lines. Even here he played it, even though it creates a weakness on f6. a4 gets a thumbs up. The bot calling for rook b1. The idea of rook b1 is to get off of this diagonal that's about to be occupied by the bishop. So you could also play knight c4 here, I would think. Oh, that's marked inaccurate, but the eval bar says I'm fine. c3, we talked about c3 in the earlier position, but you could play it here and say I'm going to blunt this diagonal even before you play bishop g7. All right, he played a4 and bishop g7 was Bobby's reply, staring menacingly across the long diagonal. Now knight c4 is played here. That gets a star here. And king's knight to e7. Why does he play his knight to e7 instead of a knight's usual favorite square? Because you don't want to block your pieces. So keep this line wide open to that rook up there in the corner. Now, to be honest, I actually liked d5 here. Hit this knight, and I get a thumbs up for this. He's going to take, and I'm going to replace it with my other pawn. The one drawback is this is open, so that could cause me trouble if he plays rook e1 check, then I block with my knight. He now has to do something about this knight. Presumably, he'll play it to e5, and then we trade knights. Then I'll take that one with my bishop. He'll take it with his rook. And then I will attack his rook and give my king a square after he retreats. And now my rooks are connected and ready to get toward the center. Coming back, bishop to f4 was played here. Now e5 hits the bishop. Now bishop g5. Bishop g3, the preference from the bot. Interesting. f6 is probably the reason, because now the bishop has to move again anyway. Bishop d2. Bishop e3 being a better choice, apparently. Leave that square for the queen or maybe one of the knights. Bobby castles, now h3 is played, and king h8, getting off of this diagonal. Even though white doesn't have a light-squared bishop, he still has a light-squared attacker that he needs to be concerned about. So get the king off of those weak squares. Queen c1, bot calling for knight a5 here. Interesting. I would think rook e1 would be an option here as well. I get a thumbs up. Queen c1 was played. f5, now bishop c3. That's marked inaccurate, with rook a3 being preferred. Personally, I'd like to undo the mistake he made on the previous turn. I get a thumbs up for that. Get that queen back where it belonged. Anyway, bishop c3. Pawn takes the e-man. Pawn takes the e-man. Now knight d4. Now you can actually play rook takes the knight here. That would be my choice, I would think. A nice exchange sacrifice, and the bot agrees. So the point here is we take the rook, and this pawn is vulnerable. Now, I don't want to take it right away because this pawn is vulnerable. So first things first, let's hit this knight. Chase the knight away so as not to leave this pawn en prise. If he plays knight a5, which was recommended earlier, then we can play knight d4. And if he plays bishop takes d4, in this example, we're going to take with this pawn. Normally, you want to capture toward the center, but because of the presence of our bishop on this diagonal, the best way to open that up is with this pawn. If you take with the c pawn, you're still blocked in by your own pieces, and you don't want to block your pieces. So here, we've created some space, and this pawn can push forward to open up again. If he plays queen g5, then we can play b6 and put the question to this knight. He'd have to retreat to b3. We still can't take this pawn because the queen's looking at our knight. Our queen's overworked. So knight c6, maybe knight d2, and we should probably get our rook into the game on an open file. So I guess we're not going to win that pawn after all, but it's always going to be feeble. That's the big point. If he plays f4 here, knight b4 is a juicy looking move, isn't it? So I never quite get this pawn, but the threat is sometimes as good as the actual execution. Let's go back. Knight d4 from Bobby Fischer on this move. And so knight takes the knight, and it's a coin toss whether you take with the bishop or the knight, isn't it? I mean, this bishop doesn't look like it has much of a future, so because it's a closed position, you may prefer to take with the bishop. But on the other hand, this bishop's presence might make you say, well, I want to keep my bishop to offset his. Redolfi went with knight takes and gets a check mark, and the bot does suggest bishop takes. Again, it's a coin toss, which way you go. Capturing toward the center gets a star. That gets a check mark. Either way, the queen's coming to g5 next, isn't it? All right, after knight d4, we get knight takes knight. Pawn takes knight from the e-pawn. Again, he's more inclined to want to open this line, so that's why he took with the e-man. Bishop to d2, pawn to d5, hitting the knight. He takes the d5, queen takes the d5, hitting the knight again. Knight's undefended. b3 defends. Knight f5. Queen d1 here, getting on an open line. Rook a to e8, getting a rook on the open file. A very principled move, even though it's marked inaccurate. The bot calling for d3. d3 puts the question to the c-man here, and probably best is to simply defend with the rook. I get a check mark. After pawn takes, I'm going to actually queen takes, to be honest, get this battery in place. And if knight d4 hitting the queen, well, I guess that's true. Then the queen would have to go back. Okay, so the bot preferring d3 from black. Don't play knight h4 here, saying I'm going to get checkmate on the next turn. You're not going to get checkmate on the next turn. Always assume your opponent is going to see the correct response. And knight h4 is going to be punished with queen g4. And then you have to go back to f5 anyway, and you've just wasted 2 moves and given your opponent 2 free moves to improve. Bobby with rook a e8. This is a principled move. Rooks like to be on open files. And the king's rook is already on a half-open f file, so it makes sense to put the queen's rook on the wide-open e file. Here, Rodolfo, wanting his share of the open file, plays rook e1. And he may have wanted to play, don't forget, this diagonal is almost open now. I'm about to push to d3 now with a discovered attack on that rook. So playing rook b1 first might be in order, or rook c1 c1 also. The bot called for rook b1, but either of these moves both get a star. The important thing is get out of the bishop's line of fire. That is the important matter here. Rook e1 from Rodolfi, and Bobby with h5. I thought black should play a6 and begin to attack here. Bobby played h5. That gets an X. The bot calling for d3 still, which is the discovered attack. I wanted to play a6 first. Presumably he'll play rook b1. Oh, that says that's inaccurate. And then my idea was b5, hit the knight. Now he could trade rooks first, but that gives me complete ownership of the open file. And after a takes b5, a takes b5. And I'm looking pretty dandy here. So knight h4 is still out of the question here in this position. We don't want to play that. Same thing as before. Queen g4 forces the knight back to f5. And then he'll still trade rooks on e8. And then he'll bring his rook over to e1. And everything will consolidate down to a fairly equal position. Let's put it up there just to show. Here, here. You're forced right back. And then he trades. And then he says, I'm going to just simplify to a draw. And in fact, the eval bar actually favors white slightly. Very smidge, but it's draw. Remember, in the eval bar world, if it's between 1 and -1, the masters will find that to be equal, generally speaking. Well, anyway, rook e1, h5 was played. Rook takes the rook on e8. Rook takes the rook. And queen f1. Bizarre-looking move. Bot calling for rook c1 this time, but just like before, rook c1 or rook b1 should be just as good. Yep, star for both. Again, the important thing is get out of the bishop's line of fire. So queen f1, preposterous move, and sure enough, d3, discovering the attack on the rook. He played c3 to interpose. Knight d6 is a mistake. Rook e2 being called for, defended by the pawn. Rooks love to be on the 7th rank. That's another thing about rooks. They like open files. They like the 7th rank, or in this case, the 2nd rank. And that's going to compel this. And we can now overwork white's queen. Now knight h4 makes sense. We get this super attack here and try to overwork this queen. That looks pretty good. Knight d6 was played. Knight takes the knight. I thought he should keep the knights on the board. Knight e3, block the file, eliminate black's control of the file. He played knight takes. It gets a thumbs up, actually, but knight e3 is called for by the bot. In fact, I get an exclam for this move. Now, it does relinquish this b-man, and that might be the hesitancy. But in order to take it, you have to give up your d-man. That gets a star. All right, at the end of the day, he went knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and now rook e1. And now that prevents rook e2. That can no longer be played. So he tried rook d8, pawn f4, queen b6. A couple of different attacks here. Now, you could play queen d5 to attack the b-man as well. That would be another way to do it. Come from this angle. And if queen f2, I think I'll play bishop f6 here, control e7. And if queen e3, then get my king to g8, get my king toward the center. See what it thinks here. Yeah, etc. Well, queen b6 not only hits the b-man, but it has the threat of c4, discovering check. He played rook e3 here. That's marked inaccurate. Bot calling for queen f2 to obstruct the diagonal. I thought f5 would be an interesting move here because that threatens rook e6, but I'm called inaccurate. But my idea was to defend the e6 square for a rook lift, hitting the queen. Rook e3 was played. Queen takes b3 is played, and bishop h6 would be something that might seem tempting. That's definitely a hotter line, but I think b4, queen d6, rook f3, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, king h7. Let's see. That's marked inaccurate, actually. We get b4, queen d6, super attacking, but rook f3 takes care of everything. Oh, that's marked as a mistake. This is the line that I was thinking of. Pawn takes. I'm loaded with mistakes and inaccuracies here. All right. It's hotter because it's bad. Yes, it's hotter because it's full of inaccuracies. So anyway, queen takes b3, simple. Rook takes d3, defended by the queen. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook. Now queen takes a4, and now he has a passed pawn. F5, marked inaccurate. Bishop E3 does keep the balance, because what that does, notice this queen aiming at D1. So the idea of Bishop E3 here is to discover control of D1 from your own queen, thereby precluding queen to D1. That wasn't played, instead F5, and Bobby took that pawn. Queen D8 check, king H7, queen D1 still in the works. Queen G5, well, queen D7 was played here. Queen D1, king F2. But he played queen d7, wanting to overwork the queen, I'm gathering. It looks at the bishop, it defends this pawn, this one is still there, and is taken. But king g8 now, and he's got to be careful how he goes, because that bishop is undefended now. So he goes back to g5, redefending, and now pinning this bishop to the king. b5, bishop f4, king f7 breaks the pin. Now h4, marked as a mistake. Queen h5 being called for. White's losing in either case. Queen h5 check is going to be answered by king e6, and if queen e2 check, king d5. If c4 check, we will take that with our b-man. And if queen f3 check, that pushes the king by force back to e6. You don't want to come up here and get skewered. Queen e2 check will be answered by king f6. And okay, then he'll probably pick up this c-man. But now we can force a queen trade, and we have a winning advantage. Two passed pawns, white would be in severe trouble. Back. So queen h5 rejected by Redolfi. Instead, he tried h4. Well, queen d1 check was bound to be played sooner or later. King h2. Pot calling for king f2. That's going to be again answered by an attempt to simplify queen g4. And he doesn't really have any good choices here but to simplify. And Bobby's more than happy to simplify. Now with this under attack, bishop d2 would be necessary, but again, I've got a passed pawn here. White is in big trouble in this line as well. White is out of decent moves. The question is just a matter of when, not if. So here Bobby did play queen g4, and right, there's no real choice for white but to simplify. And so after queen takes queen and pawn takes queen, the time control was met and resignation was tendered there. Let's run this and see the numbers. Bobby's accuracy in this game, 96.0, and his single game rating, 2950. It just is always up at the 28, 29. We've even seen 3,000 by Bobby Fischer. Remarkable.